Hello, and welcome to the Romancing in Paris podcast. I'm your host, Lily Heise. In this podcast, we'll be traveling around the city as I pick out my top romantic spots per arrondissement. You don't have to visit these places only as a couple. Exploring them can be the expression of your own love of Paris. Are you ready to get romancing in Paris? In this episode, we'll be wrapping up our romantic explorations of the arrondissements of the left bank with something of a transition site. Before delving into it, first I'll give you a little more information about the 15th district. The largest of Paris's 20 arrondissements, the 15th hugs the 7th district to the northeast, the 14th to the east, the Seine to the north, and the Parisian suburbs to the south and west. Like the 14th, the 15th is popular with middle-class families, which makes it somewhat quiet and residential. However, in my many years of research, I've found some romantic treasures in this vast arrondissement. There's a place I would really like to take you to, but for a few reasons, I thought it would be best to save it for season 2 of the podcast. Instead, today I'm taking you to a place perfect for a romantic stroll. A place with something of a fuzzy border, but one which offers splendid views of Paris's most famous site, and which also bridges France and the US. Grab your sherry. We're going to the Ile aux Cygnes. Ah, the Ile aux Cygnes, the island of the swans. So poetic and so romantic in name, as well as in appearance. Extending from beyond the bridges of the Pont Bir Hakeim to the Pont de Grenelle, the narrow, uninhabited island is technically in the middle of the Seine, and thus in between the 15th and 16th districts. However, it is administered by the former, so we can consider it as a site of the 15th. Besides being a pretty place with gorgeous views, which I'll be getting around to describing, the island also has an intriguing history. Actually, with some facts I didn't even know about before researching for this episode. Some people might not know that Paris has 3 islands, since the city's most famous 2, the Ile de la Cité and the Ile Saint-Louis, usually steal all the limelight. There are 3 islands today, but in the past there were a number of other islands, including a previous Ile aux Cygnes. Hey, wait a second. 2 Isles of the Swans. Well, there were also a few Isle of the Cows. Let's get our islands and our animals straight. The snaky Seine River is dotted with dozens, if not hundreds of islands along its 777-kilometer course from north of Dijon in Burgundy to near Le Havre in Normandy. I discovered the charms of these islands with the producer of this podcast and founder of the Paris Underground Radio, Jennifer Garrity, last year when we stayed on a private island in the Seine in the western suburbs of Paris. Within what is now the Parisian city limits, there used to be over 10 islands. The Ile de la Cité has been developed and inhabited for over 2,000 years, whereas the other islands were not. 2 small islands, which once sat at the western tip of Ile de la Cité, including one of the Isle of the Cows, were connected to the Ile de la Cité at the turn of the 17th century when the Pont Neuf and the Place Dauphine were being built. Shortly afterwards, in 1614, Ile Saint-Louis was created by joining what was called Ile Notre-Dame, even though Notre Dame wasn't on it, and yet another Isle of the Cows. This was done by architect Christophe Marie, who is the namesake of the Pont Marie, which now links the Ile Saint-Louis to the right bank. There was a third island over here, called the Louviers Island, named after its 15th century owner. In 1700, it was purchased by the city of Paris, and in 1847, the arm of the Seine between the island and the right bank was filled in, and it became today's Boulevard Morland and Quai Henry IV, in the southeast corner of the 4th District, and the start of the Rive de Seine Park. Over by the Louvre, there was another island, or rather more of a sandbank, which was not surprisingly called Ile du Louvre. This became part of the new port Saint-Nicolas, found next to the former palace of the French kings, and connected sometime around the end of the 16th century. Lastly, there was the Ile aux Cygnes, not the current-day Isle of the Swans, but a different one. It was made by joining together 5 tiny islands, including yet another Isle of the Cows, making it a total of 3 cow islands once in Paris. This bigger island was originally called Mackerel Island. No, not because they fished mackerel from its banks. Its name came from forming the words mal and querelle, literally translated as bad quarrel, or rather bad duel, as the island was a popular place for settling disputes. The island was close to where the Eiffel Tower is today, actually pretty much at the site where the Quai Branly Museum stands, and was outside the city limits of Paris for centuries. In 1554, a cemetery was created here, which was to replace one we saw in episode 2 of my other podcast, Paris Cachet. That is the cemetery created back during the Black Plague at the Hôpital de la Trinité. Unfortunately, the cemetery soon filled with many of the victims of the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, a bloody rampage against the Protestants which took place in Paris on August 24th to 25th, 1572. A little over a century later, in 1676, King Louis XIV let loose 40 swans gifted by the Embassy of Denmark on the island, which granted it the name of the Isle of the Swans. In 1722, King Louis XV gave the island to the city of Paris, and afterwards a bridge was added to connect the island to the mainland. And the island was also then designated for lumber yards. In 1812, during the later years of Napoleon I, the island was connected to the left bank at Quai Branly. So that meant au revoir, Isle of the Swans. So if that was the case, how can there still be one bearing this name, and so close to the first Parisian Swan Island? Well, the origins of the current-day Ile aux Cygnes date back to 1827, when it was a levee, or an embankment, created to protect the newly built Porte de Grenelle Bridge, which has since been replaced with a newer Porte de Grenelle Bridge. A port and merchandise depot sprung up here, and some trees were also planted on the island in the 1830s. The island would have been incorporated into Paris when this territory was annexed to the city in 1860. That original Pont de Grenelle collapsed in 1873, but was immediately rebuilt. In 1878, the island's lane, called the Allée des Cygnes, was also developed, which is today lined with over 300 trees of 60 different species. In 1900, the island's second bridge, the Pont Ruelle, was added, which now carries the RERC, and 5 years later the Viaduct du Passy, today called the Pont Bir Hakeim, was completed, bringing the island's bridge count to 3. In the 1930s, there was a plan to convert the island into a landing strip, which was thankfully abandoned. Surely a plane would have hit the Eiffel Tower at some point, but wow, talk about an amazing view those passengers would have had. Instead, for the Colonial Exhibition of 1937, the island was quadrupled in size to house temporary pavilions for that World's Fair.
We'll be right back with Romancing in Paris after a word from our sponsors. And now, back to Romancing in Paris.
Today, the island is a total length of 850 meters and has a maximum width of 11 meters at its widest point. Shall we go for a stroll to discover some of the island's loveliest attributes? I really hemmed and hawed about which end we should start with, as both have wonderful advantages. If I had to choose, I would suggest coming at it from the westernmost point. That way you will have better views the entire length of your walk. This way you'll also be met by the impressive statue which proudly stands at its westernmost tip, a quarter-scale replica of Liberty Enlightening the World, otherwise known as the Statue of Liberty. Rising to 11.5 meters, it's a bronze copy of a plaster study model made by the legendary statue's designer, Auguste Baltardy. It was a gift from the Parisian expatriate community in the U.S. and was inaugurated by the French President Marie-Françoise Sadi-Carnot on the 4th of July, 1889. Roughly 3 years after the New York statue, which was a gift from France to the U.S., was inaugurated. It originally faced east towards the Eiffel Tower, as it was inaugurated the same year as Paris's famous tower. But it was later turned to the west in 1937 during the Colonial Fair I mentioned earlier, so it now looks towards its U.S. bigger sister. The plaque on its base is inscribed with the dates the 4th of July 1776 and the 14th of July 1789 in commemoration of each country's revolutions. After you've admired the grand statue, make your way, hand in hand, down the island's tree-lined walkway. As you drift to the east, you'll have little glimpses of the Eiffel Tower through the branches. You can also lean over the balustrade to the right to get some great pictures. If you'd like to take a break to savor the tranquil ambiance of the island, there are also some lovers' benches facing the river on either side of the lane. Once you reach the East End, go up the stairs and safely cross over to the other side. You might be tempted to stop to take some photos underneath the raised metro tracks of this bridge, the Pont Bir Hakeim, which is popular on Instagram. But you can also come back to do this after you've looked out at the final view at the tip of the island, where you can take in some exceptional views of the Eiffel Tower. This little mini plaza also houses a statue called La France Résistante, or Resistant France. Originally intended to represent Joan of Arc, the bronze warrior-like figure was designed by Danish sculptor Olger Wenderkinch and was gifted to the city by its Danish residents in 1932. I find that this is a nice historical nod in connection to those swans gifted by Denmark, which were let loose on the original Isle of Swans. Actually, When I recently came to visit the island, there was a couple of swans swimming along its banks. A mere coincidence? Perhaps not. Whether you are also greeted by white lovebirds during your stroll or not, you're certain to have an enchanting and romantic visit to the Île aux Cygnes. Of course, due to its proximity to the Eiffel Tower, if you're visiting Paris for the first time, the island makes for a nice activity after you've visited the tower. Otherwise, you can continue your romancing with a stroll along the Seine, either on the left or right bank here, or journey over to the 16th district to the site I'll be revealing in the next episode of the podcast. Thank you for listening to this latest edition of Romancing in Paris. If you've enjoyed it, please subscribe. That way you won't miss the next one. I always adore ratings or reviews. If you would like to discover more romantic places in the district, see my website Je t'aime me neither for my guides to the top romantic spots per arrondissement of Paris. This podcast was produced by Paris Underground Radio. Check out their website if you're interested in listening to more great podcasts on Paris. Until next time, happy romancing in Paris.